Hey everybody, welcome to today's lecture. You had a very short reading today, which was the appendix from the Ensuring Poverty text. Sorry, I look really weird in this video, but I'm got my computer on top of the piano. So it was that appendix from Ensuring Poverty, and it was the Immodest proposal that was drafted by the Women's Committee of 100 back in the year 2000, prior to the first reauthorization of TANF in 2002. And so you've already read about this Immodest proposal. Many of you actually talked about it in your reading reflections a few weeks ago. The reason that I wanted you to read this at this particular time in the semester is to kind of bring things full circle. If you remember from the very beginning, the syllabus for this class was inspired by the welfare reform syllabus that a bunch of those people who are the signatories at the bottom of the Immodest proposal got together in the year 2016, 20 years out from TANF, to talk about the need to continue discussing, pushing policymakers, focusing on issues of poverty, particularly issues of poverty and intersectionality. The fact that, as the Immodest proposal says, the face of poverty in the United States is generally disproportionately female, and so much of the mythology around poverty in the United States casts it as a racialized identity as well. And so you need to have intersectionality in order to break the current situations down, to see how people are differently impacted by economic downturns, how people are differently impacted by poverty. So that's why I wanted you to read this. So to remind you that there was a group of activists at the very beginning of TANF who came together and tried to push legislators in a direction to make more equitable, long-term policy solutions. Of course, we know from going through everything historically that didn't happen. And so I want to share my screen right quick, and we'll just look at this document together. Hang on a second. Let me pull it up. Okay. Share screen. There we go. All right, so a couple of things I wanted to point out to make sure that you all saw this as you read the Immodest proposal. First thing is that under the general principles, it's talking about the value that our society places on caregiving work, right? And we've talked about this with relationship to the labor market as well, and kind of the idea that there is the pink collar jobs, that there is horizontal segregation that happens in the labor market. So there are some industries that are disproportionately made up of women workers, and that those jobs tend to pay much less. If you categorize those jobs, many of them fall into caregiving categories. So things like nursing aides or assistants, secretarial or office managerial type of work, childcare, house cleaning or other cleaning services, cooking, all of these types of things, you're going to find disproportionate numbers of women in those jobs, and they overall pay less. So that's a structural issue with our economic system that you need to keep in mind. And then something else that I really stood out to me in this section that I wanted to bring to your attention is this paragraph right here. It's talking about low wages, discrimination, having a history of sexual abuse or domestic violence, lacking adequate training or skills. And it says when poor caregivers meet those types of hardships, they face destitution. When middle-class caregivers encounter them, they become vulnerable to poverty for the first time. So the statistics right now in the wake of our current economic downturn, which I did not foresee last fall when I proposed this class, but we are where we are, and it's important to keep an eye on both those people who are in the deepest of deep poverty. Those are the poor caregivers who already are in vulnerable positions, who are going to actually face destitution when they encounter certain things or new challenges. versus people who might not have even been poor before, who are experiencing hardship for the first time. And our anti-poverty strategies as a nation need to be flexible enough to be responsive to both populations. And so as you're moving forward, you're thinking about your policy papers, you might want to be clear. Are you trying to alleviate the deepest of those in the deepest poverty? Are you addressing kind of this new class of poor people who weren't previously poor, but because of a variety of different hardships that they've encountered over the past year, find themselves in economically vulnerable situations? And to think about how would you propose to do your policies differently if you're trying to serve those different groups. They don't have the same needs, and it's important to keep that in mind. Also wanted to point out really this very explicit focus on intersectionality that we have coming out of the Amadeus proposal. This paragraph right here talks about, if caregivers' poverty has a woman's face, that face often belongs to a woman of color. Poverty in the United States is not colorblind. We insist that the color of poverty is a consequence of racism and related forms of discrimination. Our proposal proceeds from the recognition that race affects the material basis for caregiving, privileging some women at the expense of others. This is an intersectional analysis. This is not to say that those women who don't find themselves with those types of identities are at fault or to blame or anything like that, but that if you don't keep intersectionality in mind, if you don't think about how certain people are affected differently than other people, then you're going to have policies that are not going to be flexible enough, that are not going to actually solve the root issues of the problem. And so, in terms of bringing things full circle again, you see this here in this proposal that was written 20 years ago. Have we seen this in policies in the last 20 years? Not so much. And so there are a number of specific policy solutions that are outlined in this proposal. You've got the caregiver's allowance, and then there's some more below. And as I kind of go through these, I'd like for you all to just kind of think in your minds, like how would the world look different today if 20 years ago any of these policies had been enacted, right? Like if we've had a caregiver's allowance in place, which is not gender specific, it's available for both men and women who are caring for dependent family members. What if we had had that in place for 20 years before the current pandemic? How would that have affected the outcomes that we're seeing right now and the increases in poverty for some people, for some families? Same things below with some of these other solutions. What would it look like if we had a living wage, a federal living wage, instead of minimum wages, which are different based on different localities and different states? What if we had a federal living wage? How would that have looked different for families when they come into a pandemic situation? What would it look like if we had actual protections in place about equal pay? Then we have a crisis situation, an economic downturn. You have women who are caring for their children, but they're making the same as their male counterparts. Would that have made a difference? What if we had universal access to higher education and skill building training programs for the past 20 years? How would the world have looked different? Right, and so that's the kind of the magic of the policy world, right? You can do this with any kind of policy. We've focused on anti-poverty policy in this class for an entire semester. You can do these types of thoughts with really any type of policy. And so many of you are going to have chosen areas of anti-poverty policy to focus on that coincide or intersect with other types of interests that you have. So a number of you might be interested in reproductive health. And so you're writing about reproductive health and you're writing about poverty, but the reproductive world is much bigger. Reproductive health policy world is much bigger than just the poverty slice you're slicing out, right? So if this is a true interest of yours, it's something that you want to focus on down the line, then I encourage you to read broadly and to think about different types of policies that have been proposed, different types of policies that have been enacted, and how the world might have looked differently if different choices had been made, or you know, how might the world look differently if we're able to affect change now. Some of you are interested in education, and so you're talking about education. Same thing. Some of you are interested in things like housing, and that might, you know, intersect with an interest that you have to go into a legal career. Like, there are all kinds of different places where you might have really in-depth interests, and I'm hoping that the practice of dissecting policies, thinking deeply about them, and thinking about other potential policy solutions are going to broaden your perspective so that you're able to consider more applications. And same thing as well for those of you who might not necessarily be interested in anything related to policy as a career, but who just want to be informed voters, right? So all of us have that ability to affect change through our personal activism and through voting. And so hopefully this is also something that you're going to walk away from this class thinking about is what your role should be as an active and informed citizen. So I know this was just a short little reading. I thought that it was an interesting one considering where you are in your final paper preparation. You'll see here that a number of the suggested programs for consideration are things that you might be thinking of yourself as you're writing your papers. So, you know, child support, healthcare, housing, disability insurance and supports, all those types of things. Those might be things that you're considering as policy options. So, you know, wanted to put these here as another place where you could be like, oh, right, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that one yet. And maybe it's something that you're going to consider when you're writing your paper, or, you know, it's probably too late right now for your debates, which are shortly, but for your paper, absolutely. Hopefully these will give some additional ideas. So that's all I have for today. Just wanted to go over this briefly, and you know, I look forward to hearing your debates this week, and I will see you all later. Thanks.